We ended the last lecture module with a discussion of framing. We looked at a number of examples that help to illustrate how the way in which a situation presents a problem to us can serve to make underlying structural features more obvious to us, or can obscure those underlying structural features, can make content more salient, or make content more opaque. In doing so, it affects our ability to understand a problem and to solve a problem. Now we want to turn our attention in this lecture module to the notion of a fallacy and tie the notion of a fallacy through the case of informal fallacies to framing. So we think of fallacies as rhetorically successful arguments that are convincing despite logical deficiencies that should render them unsuccessful or unconvincing. In other words, they appear logically compelling, despite the fact that they're oftentimes unsound or uncogent or highly contentious when we examine them closer. So, for example, formal fallacies are invalid deductive arguments. Now, formal fallacies may appear more successful than their logical form and content dictate, in part because humans are natively sensitive to that content, and it drives their formation and evaluation of such arguments. And they're relatively insensitive to the underlying logical form, which makes it difficult for them to see defects in logical form. Formal fallacies can also benefit from limitations in working memory that circumvent proper evaluation of either the form or the content. In some cases, however, the presentation of the argument obscures its defect, so that one can only discover it by taking both content and context into account, as well as logical form. And it's these arguments that logicians refer to as informal fallacies. Now, like formal fallacies, informal fallacies appear to be more rhetorically successful, more convincing than their content and logical form warrant. Unlike formal fallacies, though, the source of an informal fallacy's appeal derives from the interplay between logical form and content, and importantly, framing. In general, the manner in which a situation frames the fallacy serves to misrepresent the character of the problem, so that it makes the problem seem like it's a different kind of problem, or it makes some information very salient, even if it's not particularly relevant, or it obscures or renders opaque other information that is important to evaluating the argument, the inference, or the decision. So framing, as understood in this chapter and lectures then, consists in the impact of the context in which one encounters a choice, an inference, or an argument upon one's ability to choose, to infer, or to evaluate that argument. And how does that exactly work? Well, most informal fallacies, like most good rock and roll songs, have a hook. That is, they have a catch that brings you in. It makes you think it's going to love you tender when it's really going to treat you like a fool, treat you mean and cruel. In fact, what most informal fallacies play upon native human reasoning tendencies. And there are two ways framing serves to facilitate this preying upon native human reasoning tendencies to create a false impression of the overall success of an argument. And those two ways consist in what I call schema distortion and content distortion, SD or CD for short. Schema distortion describes situations where the context frames a situation in such a way that one's brain miscategorizes that situation in a manner that leads one to adopt an inappropriate inference or decision strategy. What would be a concrete example of this? The informal fallacy of appeal to force attempts to illicitly frame a choice or the conclusion of an argument so that one's rejection or acceptance of that choice or argument conclusion becomes associated with something that threatens one's well-being. Consider an example.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live. are to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Johnson's Daisy commercial attempts to take the relatively straightforward decision process of choosing a presidential candidate, say based on experience or qualifications or temperament or likability, and instead infuses it with this perception of an unevinced existential threat. In doing so, it causes your brain to change the schema, change the category that it uses to evaluate this problem. It's now thinking about this problem in terms of risk, in terms of threat. And that's how schema distortion works. It changes the way your brain thinks about a problem so that you're no longer thinking about it, say, in terms of decision theory, but instead you're thinking of it in terms of social cognition. The other schema that we look at is content distortion. Content distortion describes situations where the context frames that situation such that irrelevant features of the problem or inference or argument seem salient, that is important, or that important features seem obscure, irrelevant, or opaque. An excellent illustration of content distortion comes in the form of the informal fallacy of hasty generalization. In cases of hasty generalization, one has made a number of observations about the environment from which a pattern has emerged in that small sample size. Our native System 1 inference strategies tend to focus upon the value that we observe in the sample and tend to ignore or to play down the size of the sample as well as its evidential merit, its likelihood to be representative of the population from which it was drawn. As a result, we're often making generalizations on the basis of samples that are just not predictive.
For example, in this clip from the 1967 Batman TV show, Robin makes a hasty generalization from an unrepresentative sample of a single individual case.
Holy Heidelberg, what'd you do that for?
I'm afraid we've been drugged, Robin.
I guess you could never trust a woman.
You made a hasty generalization, Robin. It's a bad habit to get into.
So Batman rightly chastises Robin for making a generalization on the basis of a single experience. There are a lot of videos out there that purport to be hasty generalizations that don't actually look like they're inferences that would qualify as generalizations. That is, going from specific experiences to generalizing about that whole class. But when you start thinking about hasty generalizations, you realize that there are lots and lots and lots of cases of unrepresentative samples that we might make inferences from. So an example that you might think of is the before and after pictures that you see from weight loss ads. Now, these two on top here are photos from a 2014 FTC judgment against this company. And one of the reasons why the FTC entered this judgment against this company is they said they created a false impression of what their product could accomplish by relying very excessively on these before and after isolated pictures of success. If you just focus on isolated, very successful cases, then you ignore what the product, the diet, the method will accomplish on average for all sorts of different people in all sorts of different circumstances. And so you get a very distorted view about the efficacy of that product. Additionally, if you just focus on the period of time where the person is losing weight and you don't look at their long-term weight maintenance, then what you'll discover oftentimes is even when people are capable of losing a lot of weight, they tend to gain it back over time if they don't do it in a sustainable fashion, and that's the most important thing for weight loss. These products can also have bad health effects, particularly if you're losing a lot of weight really fast. That turns out to be not good for people. And finally, the data may not even be representative because these before and after pictures are actually quite easy to fake. This is from an article by a professional trainer. Took these two pictures within, 10 or 15 minutes of each other that seemed to portray that person as dramatically different just by using tricks, not by having engaged in an exercise program or any dieting program. Examples like these are examples where we're presented with something as though it's good data, but data really isn't representative, and it wouldn't be a good idea for us to generalize that people are going to be able to lose weight in the way that these people in the particular ad did, that they're going to keep it off in a way that the ad might suggest that they do, and so on.